The morning fog hung thick over Edwards Air Force Base like a gray blanket, obscuring the massive hangars that housed America's most classified aircraft. Inside Hangar 7, the most elite test pilots in the United States Air Force were gathering for what many considered the ultimate proving ground, a selection process for the most advanced stealth aircraft program in military history. These weren't ordinary pilots. These were the best of the best, men and women who had already proven themselves in combat zones across the globe, graduates of the most prestigious flight schools, holders of records that most aviators could only dream of achieving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The hangar itself was a cathedral of aviation excellence. Gleaming fighter jets worth hundreds of millions of dollars sat in perfect formation, their swept wings and angular surfaces designed to slip through enemy radar like ghosts in the night. The concrete floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the overhead lights that illuminated every bolt and rivet of the magnificent machine surrounding them. The air carried the distinctive smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of high-tech composites that defined modern aerospace engineering. Colonel Marcus Richardson stood at the center of it all, his uniform pressed to perfection, his silver eagles catching the light as he surveyed the assembled pilots. At 48, Richardson commanded respect through sheer presence alone. His chest displayed ribbons from 3 wars, commendations for test pilot work that had pushed the boundaries of human flight, and decorations that spoke of classified missions where failure meant more than just a failed grade, it meant national security implications that could reshape global politics. When Richardson spoke, even the most cocky fighter jocks listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for life-or-death briefings. The pilots arranged before him represented the pinnacle of military aviation. Major Jake Thompson, call sign Viper, had logged over 3,000 hours in F-22 Raptors and held the record for the fastest recorded intercept in Air Force history. His jaw was square, his confidence absolute, and his reputation for precision flying legendary among his peers. Captain Sarah Mitchell, known as Phoenix, had been the first woman to complete the most grueling aerial combat training program ever devised, earning her wings through missions that had broken lesser pilots, physically and mentally. Lieutenant Colonel David Brooks, Razor, brought 15 years of special operations flying experience, including black missions that officially never happened in countries that didn't appear on any public map. These aviators wore their flight suits like armor, each patch and insignia telling stories of aerial mastery that few humans would ever experience. Their helmets, customized with personal call signs and unit emblems, sat nearby like the crowns of aviation royalty. They carried themselves with the kind of swagger that came from knowing they could take a $50 million aircraft through maneuvers that would terrify commercial airline passengers, pushing metal and physics to their absolute limits while maintaining the split-second decision-making that separated the living from the dead in aerial combat. That the conversation among them buzzed with technical jargon about thrust-to-weight ratios, stealth capabilities, and flight envelope limitations that would sound like foreign language to civilian ears. They discussed classified aircraft specifications with the casual familiarity of people who had spent their careers dancing on the edge of what was physically possible, turning theoretical aerodynamics into reality through pure skill and nerves. Of steel dot, it was into this environment of supreme confidence and technical mastery that Rebecca Chen walked on that fog-shrouded Tuesday morning in October. She appeared at the hangar's massive doorway like a figure from a different world entirely, her slight frame silhouetted against the gray morning light that filtered through the dissipating mist. At first glance, she looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn somewhere on the sprawling base, perhaps a civilian contractor or administrative personnel who had wandered into the wrong building. Rebecca stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that had probably looked the same for years. She wore a standard flight suit, but it seemed to hang on her small frame in a way that made her appear even younger than her 29 years. Her face was unremarkable in the way that made people's eyes slide past her in a crowd, no dramatic features or commanding presence that demanded attention. She carried a worn canvas bag that looked like it had seen better decades, and her boots showed the kind of scuffing that suggested long use rather than careful military maintenance. What caught everyone's attention wasn't her appearance, though it was certainly unexpected in this gathering of aviation elite. It was what she was carrying in her free hand, a small paper airplane, folded from what appeared to be ordinary office paper, its edges slightly crumpled as if it had been hastily constructed. The sight was so incongruous in this environment of cutting-edge aerospace technology that several pilots actually stopped their conversations to stare. Major Thompson was the first to notice her, his conversation about afterburner specifications trailing off as he watched Rebecca make her way across the hangar floor. He nudged Captain Mitchell and nodded toward the approaching figure. "Looks like someone's lost," he said, his voice carrying the kind of amused condescension that came naturally to people accustomed to being the most qualified person in any room. Rebecca moved with a quiet confidence that seemed completely at odds with how out of place she looked. While the other pilots strutted around the hangar like peacocks displaying their technical knowledge and combat experience, she simply found an empty space near the wall and began organizing her minimal equipment with methodical precision. The contrast was striking. Millions of dollars worth of the most advanced flight gear in the world, surrounding someone whose only apparent preparation was a paper airplane that probably cost less than a penny to make. Captain Mitchell felt a familiar mixture of embarrassment and protective concern as she watched Rebecca's solitary preparation. As one of only 3 women in a field dominated by testosterone and ego, Mitchell had fought every day of her career to prove that she belonged among the elite. Seeing another woman show up looking so unprepared for such a prestigious selection process made her cringe internally. The men in this program were already looking for any excuse to suggest that women couldn't handle the pressure and demands of advanced test pilot work. "Someone should probably tell her this isn't a paper airplane contest," Mitchell whispered to Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, her voice carrying frustration that had nothing to do with Rebecca personally and everything to do with the additional scrutiny that Rebecca's presence would inevitably bring to all the women in the program. Brooks shook his head in disbelief, his years of special operations experience having taught him to quickly assess threats and capabilities. Rebecca didn't fit any category he recognized. "This is supposed to be the most competitive pilot selection in Air Force history," he said quietly. "How did someone with a paper airplane get clearance to be here?" The buzz of conversation around the hangar grew louder as more pilots noticed Rebecca and her unusual preparation ritual. Some pulled out phones to discreetly capture photos of what they assumed would become a legendary story about the civilian who somehow wandered into the most exclusive aviation program in the military. Others shook their heads in disgust, viewing her presence as evidence that standards were being lowered for political reasons rather than maintained for operational necessity. Flight Sergeant Maria Santos, a crew chief with 20 years of experience maintaining the most sophisticated aircraft in the Air Force inventory, approached Rebecca's position with a clipboard and a diplomatic expression that barely concealed her confusion. Santos had seen every type of pilot imaginable over her career, from brand new second lieutenants who were terrified of scratching multi-million-dollar aircraft to grizzled colonels who could land a damaged fighter on a carrier deck in a hurricane. But she had never encountered someone quite like this. "Ma'am," Santos said, her voice professional but tinged with concern, "I need to verify your credentials and equipment specifications for today's evaluation. This is a classified program with specific security requirements." Her eyes kept drifting to the paper airplane in Rebecca's hand, trying to understand how such an object fit into any conceivable flight training scenario. "Rebecca-chan," she replied quietly, handing Santos a folder without looking up from her simple preparation routine. "My authorization should be in order." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying none of the bravado or competitive edge that characterized most of the pilots Santos dealt with regularly. Santos opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside. What she found made her pause and read more carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to surprise. The authorization forms bore signatures from levels of command she rarely encountered, and the pilot classification codes were unlike anything in her extensive experience with military aviation personnel. There were references to specialized training programs and qualification standards that weren't part of normal Air Force documentation. "These certifications," Santos said slowly, still studying the papers with growing bewilderment, "some of these programs aren't in our current database. Where exactly did you complete this flight training?" The question carried professional curiosity mixed with genuine confusion about how someone could possess qualifications that didn't appear in standard military records. Rebecca finally looked up from her preparation, meeting Santos's gaze with calm brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience that were hard to place. "Various locations," she said simply, "over the years." The vagueness of her response only added to Santos's confusion, but the paperwork was undeniably legitimate, complete with official seals and authorization codes that checked out when she ran them through the computerized verification system. Whatever Rebecca's background, someone with serious authority had approved her participation in this highly classified selection process. The kind of authority that didn't typically involve itself in routine pilot evaluations, suggesting that Rebecca's presence represented something far more significant than routine personnel assignment. As word spread about the mysterious woman with the paper airplane, more pilots drifted over to observe her preparation routine with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for watching someone about to make a spectacular mistake. What they saw defied their expectations in ways that were difficult to articulate. Despite the obvious simplicity of her equipment, Rebecca handled her paper airplane with a kind of reverence that suggested deep familiarity with its construction and capabilities. She made tiny adjustments to the fold lines with the precision of someone who understood aerodynamics at an intuitive level, testing the balance and weight distribution with movements that spoke of countless hours of practice and refinement. Her worn canvas bag contained accessories that were as simple as the airplane itself: pencils for making calculations, sheets of graph paper covered in handwritten notes, and a small collection of measuring tools that looked like they had been borrowed from a high school geometry class. Everything about her setup screamed amateur hour compared to the sophisticated flight equipment surrounding her. Yet there was something about the way she organized and handled her materials that suggested otherwise. Major Thompson couldn't resist walking over to get a closer look at what he assumed would be comic relief before the serious business of pilot selection began. "That's quite an aircraft you've got there," he said, his tone carrying the kind of patronizing amusement that came naturally to someone who had never met a flying challenge he couldn't master. "Does it come with ejection seats, or are you planning to parachute out if things get rough?" His comment triggered appreciative laughter from the other pilots, who had gathered to witness what they expected to be Rebecca's inevitable realization that she was completely out of her depth. The contrast between Thompson's confidence and Rebecca's quiet preparation was stark enough to make several pilots wonder if this was some kind of elaborate practical joke being played on the selection process. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca continued working with her paper airplane, apparently immune to the growing attention and commentary directed her way. She was making minute adjustments to the wing angles, consulting her handwritten notes with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was following procedures learned through extensive trial and error rather than formal instruction. The morning California sun climbed higher, burning off the coastal fog and revealing the full scope of Edwards Air Force Base, stretching toward the desert horizon. The base represented the cutting edge of American aerospace development, where the boundaries of flight were constantly being pushed by pilots and engineers who transformed theoretical possibilities into operational realities. Test flights here regularly achieved speeds and altitudes that civilian aviation couldn't approach, using aircraft that represented billions of dollars in research and development. Rebecca's presence in this environment created a cognitive dissonance that none of the assembled pilots quite knew how to process. Here was someone who appeared to embody everything that modern military aviation had evolved beyond simplicity where sophistication was required, intuition where precise calculation was demanded, and calm confidence where aggressive competitiveness was expected. The pilots surrounding her represented hundreds of thousands of hours of flight, time in the most advanced aircraft ever built. They had trained in simulators that cost more than most people's houses, studied aerodynamics at universities that specialized in aerospace engineering, and proven themselves in combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Yet there was something about Rebecca's quiet preparation that began to unsettle the more observant among them. Despite the obvious limitations of her equipment, she handled it with a familiarity that bordered on artistic, making adjustments and refinements with the kind of unconscious competence that came from deep understanding rather than memorized. Procedures. The morning routine at Edwards followed protocols developed over decades of test pilot training evolution. Pilots arrived early to study weather conditions, review aircraft specifications, and mentally prepare for evaluations that could determine the trajectory of their entire careers. Every detail mattered in this environment, from atmospheric pressure readings to wind speed calculations that could affect flight performance in ways that civilian pilots never had to consider. Rebecca's casual approach to this intensive preparation seemed to mock the careful professionalism that defined Edwards' Air Force Base culture. While other pilots obsessed over minute details that could provide competitive advantages, she appeared content to sit quietly with her paper airplane, occasionally making notes on her graph paper, but otherwise showing no signs of the anxiety or focused intensity that characterized serious aviation competition. The irony wasn't lost on the more experienced pilots that someone who appeared so unprepared for the technical demands of advanced flight testing had somehow gained authorization to participate in one of the most exclusive programs in military aviation. The paperwork that Flight Sergeant Santos had verified suggested involvement from command levels that didn't typically concern themselves with individual pilot selections, raising questions about Rebecca's background that her simple appearance couldn't answer. The briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base buzzed with nervous energy as the 24 selected pilots filed in for their first official evaluation session. The walls were lined with photographs of legendary test pilots who had pushed the boundaries of flight: Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, test pilots who had survived crashes that should have been fatal, and the brave souls who had taken experimental aircraft into realms where physics became a matter of life and death. The room itself was a shrine to aviation courage, where careers were made and dreams were shattered with equal frequency. At the front of the room stood a massive display showing the silhouette of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, its distinctive triangular shape looking more like something from science fiction than a real aircraft. The specifications scrolling across the screen were staggering: a flying wing design that could carry nuclear payloads across continents while remaining virtually invisible to enemy radar systems. This wasn't just another aircraft. It was a weapon system that represented the absolute pinnacle of aerospace engineering. requiring pilots whose skills transcended conventional flight training. Colonel Richardson stepped to the podium with the bearing of someone who had personally flown missions that remained classified decades after their completion. His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen the consequences of pilot error measured not in damaged equipment, but in geopolitical catastrophe. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes scanning the assembled aviators with the intensity of a hunter evaluating prey. "You are here because someone believes you possess the extraordinary capabilities required to operate the most advanced stealth aircraft in the world." The pilots sat in perfect formation, their attention absolute as Richardson outlined the selection process that would determine who among them possessed the rare combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and adaptability required for stealth operations. The program they were entering existed at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and human performance, where the margin for error was measured in microseconds and the consequences of failure could reshape international relations. Rebecca Shung sat in the back row, her paper airplane resting on the desk in front of her like a child's toy among sophisticated military equipment. The contrast was so stark that several pilots found themselves glancing back at her throughout Richardson's presentation, trying to understand how someone with such obviously inadequate preparation had gained access to this elite program. Major Thompson leaned over to Captain Mitchell during a brief pause in the presentation. "I'm starting to think this is some kind of psychological evaluation," he whispered, nodding toward Rebecca's position. "Maybe they're testing how we react to obviously unqualified personnel in our ranks." His theory seemed logical. Military training often included unexpected elements designed to evaluate how candidates responded to unusual circumstances. The technical specifications that Richardson presented were mind-boggling in their complexity. The B-2 Spirit represented 20 years of development and over $40 billion in research costs, incorporating stealth technology that made it virtually undetectable to conventional radar systems. The aircraft's flying wing design eliminated traditional control surfaces, requiring pilots to work with computer-assisted flight systems that could process thousands of calculations per second. The aerodynamic characteristics of this aircraft, Richardson explained, gesturing toward the massive screen display, challenge every assumption you've learned about conventional flight dynamics. There are no traditional rudders, elevators, or ailerons. Control is achieved through split flaps, differential thrust, and computer systems that make thousands of micro-adjustments every second to maintain stable flight. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks found himself mentally calculating the complexity of systems he would need to master, comparing them to the special operations aircraft he had flown throughout his career. Even his most sophisticated previous assignments seemed simple compared to the technical challenges that stealth bomber operations would demand. The aircraft required pilots who could think in 3 dimensions while managing computer systems, navigation equipment, and weapons delivery systems that operated at the very limits of human comprehension. The weather briefing that followed Richardson's presentation added another layer of complexity to the selection challenge. Edwards Air Force Base was experiencing unusual atmospheric conditions. A massive storm system was approaching from the Pacific, bringing with it wind shear, electromagnetic interference, and visibility conditions that would test even the most experienced pilots. The timing wasn't coincidental. Part of the selection process involved demonstrating capability under adverse conditions that simulated real-world operational requirements. "Stealth operations don't wait for perfect weather," Richardson continued, his tone suggesting hard-earned experience with the realities of military aviation. Enemy air defense systems don't shut down because of storms, and mission requirements don't change because conditions become challenging. The pilots we select must be capable of delivering precision performance regardless of environmental factors. Rebecca continued taking notes on her graph paper, her pencil moving across the handwritten charts with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she was following established procedures rather than improvising solutions. Her calculations appeared to involve basic aerodynamic principles, but she was applying them to her paper airplane with the same seriousness that other pilots brought to multi-million-dollar aircraft systems. Flight Sergeant Santos approached the briefing podium during the equipment inspection period, carrying a tablet loaded with technical specifications for each pilot's assigned aircraft systems. The sophisticated avionics packages that most pilots would be working with included GPS navigation accurate to within inches, radar systems capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously, and communication equipment that could maintain contact with command centers across continents. Each pilot will be evaluated on their ability to integrate with advanced flight management systems, Santos announced, reading from her official checklist. Successful candidates must demonstrate proficiency with digital flight controls, automated navigation systems, and weapons delivery computers that represent the current state of aerospace technology. The equipment requirements alone were intimidating to pilots who had spent years mastering conventional aircraft systems. The B-2 Spirit demanded familiarity with computer interfaces that controlled everything from engine management to stealth signature optimization, requiring mental processing speeds that approach the limits of human capability. Rebecca raised her hand during the equipment briefing, her movement so unexpected that several pilots turned to stare. "Excuse me, Flight Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the assertive confidence that characterized most military aviators. "Will there be any evaluation of fundamental aerodynamic understanding independent of computer assistance?" The question surprised Santos, who had expected concerns about technical training or equipment familiarization rather than theoretical aviation principles. "Ma'am, modern stealth aircraft operations require integration with sophisticated computer systems. Fundamental aerodynamics are assumed to be part of your basic pilot training." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, as if considering information that somehow related to her paper airplane preparation. "I understand. I was just curious whether manual flight control capabilities would be tested in case of system failures." Her follow-up question revealed a level of thinking about backup procedures that impressed some of the more experienced pilots, even though her equipment suggested she couldn't possibly understand the complexity of modern flight systems. Major Thompson couldn't resist commenting on Rebecca's questions. "Are you planning to fly the stealth bomber manually if the computers fail?" he asked, his tone carrying amusement mixed with genuine curiosity about her thought process. "Because that paper airplane isn't going to help you understand fly-by-wire control systems." His comment drew quiet laughter from nearby pilots who shared his confusion about Rebecca's preparation methods. The idea that someone could master stealth aircraft operations through paper airplane experimentation seemed so absurd that it became a source of entertainment rather than serious concern. Captain Mitchell felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention that Rebecca was drawing to the female pilots in the program. Every comment about Rebecca's unusual methods reflected on all the women present, adding pressure to an already competitive environment where gender remained a factor in how performance was evaluated and interpreted. "This isn't flight school," Mitchell said during a break in the presentation, her frustration evident to anyone listening carefully. "This is the most advanced pilot training in the world, and someone shows up with a paper airplane like it's career day at elementary school. It makes all of us look unprofessional." The technical demonstration that followed the briefing session revealed the true scope of what stealth bomber operations demanded from pilots. The flight simulator complex at Edwards represented millions of dollars in computer technology designed to replicate every aspect of B-2 operations. From takeoff procedures through combat missions and emergency landings, the simulator cockpit was a maze of digital displays, touchscreen interfaces, and control systems that bore little resemblance to conventional aircraft. Pilots had to monitor dozens of separate computer systems while maintaining awareness of navigation, weather, mission objectives, and potential threats that could appear without warning. The cognitive workload was staggering, requiring mental processing capabilities that eliminated all but the most exceptional candidates. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks emerged from his simulator session with renewed respect for the complexity of stealth operations. It's like trying to conduct a symphony orchestra while solving calculus problems and playing three-dimensional chess simultaneously, he told Major Thompson during the post-flight debriefing. Computer assistance is essential, but you still need to understand what every system is doing and be ready to take manual control if anything fails. The preliminary scores from the simulator sessions confirmed what most pilots had expected. The technical complexity of stealth aircraft operations eliminated candidates who had been successful in conventional flight programs. Pilots who had mastered fighter jets found themselves struggling with computer interfaces that required different types of thinking and reaction times. Rebecca's turn in the simulator created a buzz of anticipation among the other candidates. Everyone wanted to see how someone with such minimal preparation would handle the most sophisticated flight training system ever developed. The expectation was unanimous. She would be overwhelmed by complexity that challenged even the most experienced military aviators. When Rebecca settled into the simulator cockpit, her paper airplane tucked carefully into her flight suit pocket, the contrast between her simple preparation and the surrounding technology was almost comical. The cockpit displays alone represented more computing power than most universities possessed, yet she approached the controls with the same calm concentration she had shown while working with her folded paper. The simulation began with basic flight operations, taxiing, takeoff, and level flight maneuvers that allowed pilots to familiarize themselves with the aircraft's unique characteristics. The B-2's flying wing design created flight dynamics that defied conventional pilot training, requiring constant computer assistance to maintain stable flight attitudes. Rebecca's performance during the basic flight phase surprised the evaluators. Monitoring her session, instead of struggling with the computer interfaces like most candidates, she seemed to intuitively understand the relationship between control inputs and aircraft response. Her movements were smooth and natural, suggesting familiarity with unconventional flight dynamics that shouldn't have been possible given her apparent lack of advanced training. The weather simulation that followed tested pilots' ability to maintain control during the kind of adverse conditions that made stealth operations particularly challenging. Simulated wind shear, electromagnetic interference, and visibility limitations created scenarios where even experienced pilots struggled to maintain aircraft control while managing mission requirements. Major Thompson watched Rebecca's simulation through the observation window, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion as her performance exceeded every expectation. "She's flying that thing like she's been doing it for years," he told Captain Mitchell, his voice carrying disbelief mixed with grudging professional respect. Those are not the reactions of someone learning the system for the first time. The simulation scores, posted at the end of the evaluation session, created an uncomfortable silence among the assembled pilots. Rebecca's performance hadn't just been competent, it had been exceptional, demonstrating mastery of complex flight systems that typically required months of specialized training to understand. Her scores ranked in the top 3 among all candidates, achieved through methods that none of the evaluators could explain. Flight Sergeant Santos approached Rebecca after the simulation session with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit any recognizable pattern. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "your performance in the simulator was outstanding, but I'm having difficulty understanding how you achieved those results. The control techniques you used aren't part of standard training curricula." Rebecca's response was characteristically understated. "Paper airplanes taught me to think about flight dynamics without depending on computer assistance," she said simply, pulling her folded aircraft from her pocket and examining it thoughtfully. "When you understand how air moves over surfaces, The principles apply regardless of scale or complexity. The explanation seemed impossibly simple for the sophisticated performance they had witnessed, yet it was the only insight Rebecca offered into her methods. The other pilots found themselves looking at her paper airplane with new eyes, trying to understand how such a basic tool could provide insights into advanced aerodynamics that their expensive training had apparently missed. The second day of evaluations dawned with ominous gray clouds gathering over the Mojave Desert, their dark presence confirming meteorological predictions of the severe weather system approaching. Edwards Air Force Base, the morning briefing room, carried a different energy than the previous day. The initial simulator results had created an unexpected hierarchy among the candidates, with Rebecca Chun's performance becoming a topic of heated discussion among pilots who were struggling to reconcile her simple methods with her exceptional scores. Wing Commander Patricia Hayes, a veteran test pilot with over 5,000 hours in experimental aircraft, had flown in from Washington specifically to observe this selection process. Her reputation preceded her into every room she entered. She had been the first woman to successfully test fly 3 different prototype stealth aircraft, earning her place among the most respected aviators in the Air Force through missions that pushed both technology and human capability to their absolute limits. Hayes possessed the kind of credibility that made even the most arrogant fighter pilots listen when she spoke. Yesterday's simulator results have raised some interesting questions, Hayes announced to the assembled candidates, her steel gray eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone accustomed to identifying weaknesses that could prove fatal at 30,000 feet. Today's evaluations will focus on tactical decision-making under pressure, emergency procedures, and the kind of split-second judgment that separates competent pilots from exceptional ones. The tactical scenarios Hayes outlined were designed to simulate real-world stealth operations where pilots faced multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining mission objectives that could affect national security. These weren't training exercises with predetermined solutions. They were complex, problem-solving challenges that required creativity, technical knowledge, and the ability to think several steps ahead of rapidly evolving situations. Major Jake Thompson had spent the previous evening reviewing Rebecca's simulator data, trying to understand how someone with such unconventional preparation could achieve scores that exceeded his own carefully planned performance. His reputation as one of the Air Force's premier fighter pilots was built on technical precision and competitive dominance, qualities that had never failed him throughout his career. The idea that a woman with a paper airplane could outperform his sophisticated approach challenged fundamental assumptions about what constituted proper pilot training. "I've been thinking about Chun's performance," Thompson said to Lieutenant Colonel David Brooks during the pre-flight briefing period. "There's something we're missing here. Nobody achieves those kinds of scores on advanced flight systems without extensive prior training. Either she's had access to classified programs we don't know about, or there's some kind of evaluation error." Brooks nodded thoughtfully, his special operations background having taught him to recognize when situations didn't fit expected patterns. "The way she handles complex flight dynamics suggests muscle memory developed through years of practice," he agreed. "But with what? Paper airplanes don't provide the kind of training necessary for computer-assisted flight control systems." The mystery surrounding Rebecca's capabilities had become a source of growing frustration among pilots who prided themselves on understanding the technical requirements of advanced aviation. Her methods defied every principle they had learned about proper preparation, training methodologies, and equipment requirements that defined elite military flying. Captain Sarah Mitchell found herself caught between professional curiosity and personal concern about Rebecca's impact on the program's perception of female pilots. Mitchell's own success had been achieved through meticulous preparation, exhaustive study of technical manuals, and the kind of aggressive competitiveness that forced male colleagues to acknowledge her capabilities. Rebecca's casual approach, seemed to mock everything Mitchell had sacrificed to earn respect in a male-dominated field. "She's making us all look like we don't know what we're doing," Mitchell confided to Flight Sergeant Maria Santos during the equipment check period. "I've spent years proving that women can master complex flight systems through hard work and dedication. And now someone shows up acting like aviation is simple enough to learn from children's toys." Santos had observed thousands of pilots throughout her career, developing an instinct for identifying those who possessed the rare combination of technical skill and mental toughness required for test pilot work. Rebecca's behavior pattern didn't fit any category she recognized, yet her performance results suggested capabilities that exceeded most of the carefully selected candidates in the program. The morning's first evaluation involved navigation challenges that tested pilots' ability to plan and execute flight paths through defended airspace while maintaining stealth protocols that required precise altitude control, timing coordination, and route optimization. The scenarios were based on actual mission profiles that stealth bomber crews might face in hostile territories where detection meant almost certain destruction. Rebecca approached the navigation planning session with the same methodical simplicity that had characterized her previous preparations. While other pilots used sophisticated computer programs to calculate optimal flight paths, she worked with her graph paper and pencils, sketching route diagrams that looked like elementary school geography projects compared to the digital precision of her competitor's work. Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh, the senior navigation instructor responsible for evaluating tactical planning capabilities, observed Rebecca's preparation with growing bewilderment. Walsh had trained some of the finest tactical aviators in the Air Force, developing curricula that integrated the latest advances in GPS technology, satellite communication, and computerized threat analysis systems. "Man," Walsh said, approaching Rebecca's planning station with diplomatic professionalism, "I notice you're using manual calculation methods for route planning. The advanced navigation systems available to stealth bomber crews provide precision capabilities that manual methods simply cannot match." Rebecca looked up from her handwritten charts, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "You're absolutely right, Master Sergeant," she replied quietly. "Computer navigation systems provide accuracy and speed that manual methods can't approach under normal circumstances." She paused, returning her attention to her simple calculations. "I'm just curious what happens when those systems fail." Her response revealed a level of thinking about backup procedures and system redundancy that impressed Walsh despite his confusion about her methods. Most pilots focused on mastering primary systems without dedicating significant thought to manual alternatives that might become necessary during equipment failures or electronic warfare scenarios. The navigation evaluation results provided fresh ammunition for Rebecca's critics, while simultaneously deepening the mystery surrounding her capabilities. Her manually calculated flight paths achieved the mission objectives with precision that matched computer-generated solutions, but her methods took significantly longer than the time constraints that real-world operations would impose. Major Thompson seized on these timing discrepancies as evidence that Rebecca's unconventional approach was fundamentally flawed for actual stealth operations. "This isn't recreational flying," he announced loudly enough for Rebecca to hear clearly. "Mission timing requirements don't adjust because someone prefers to use a slide rule instead of modern navigation computers." His criticism gained support from other pilots who viewed Rebecca's manual methods as evidence of inadequate technical preparation for the demands of stealth aircraft operations. The consensus among the more vocal candidates was that Rebecca's simulator success had been a fluke that wouldn't translate to real-world performance requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks decided to address the situation more directly, approaching Rebecca during the lunch break with the bearing of a senior officer providing guidance to someone who needed professional development. "Chen," he said formally, "I've been observing your preparation methods. and I'm concerned that you may be handicapping yourself unnecessarily." Rebecca listened attentively as Brooks outlined his assessment of modern stealth operations, explaining how technological integration had evolved beyond the point where manual backup procedures could provide adequate capability for mission success. His analysis was comprehensive and technically sound, reflecting years of experience with cutting-edge aviation systems. "The reality is that stealth bomber operations exist at the intersection of human capability and computer assistance," Brooks continued. "Pilots who can't integrate seamlessly with advanced systems won't be able to perform the missions these aircraft are designed to accomplish. Your approach seems to emphasize independence from technology that's actually essential for operational success." Rebecca's response surprised Brooks with its depth of understanding about the relationship between human skill and technological capability. "You make excellent points, Lieutenant Colonel," she said thoughtfully. "Technology certainly provides capabilities that human pilots cannot match independently. But I've always found it useful to understand the underlying principles that make technology possible, in case circumstances require alternatives." The afternoon evaluation session focused on emergency procedures that tested pilots' ability to maintain aircraft control during system failures, combat damage scenarios, and the kind of mechanical problems that could transform routine flights into life-or-death situations. These simulations were designed to identify candidates who possessed the mental toughness and technical creativity necessary to survive catastrophic equipment failures. The emergency scenarios began with relatively straightforward challenges: single engine failures, hydraulic system problems, and communication equipment malfunctions that required pilots to demonstrate standard emergency procedures while maintaining mission capabilities. As the simulations progressed, the problems became increasingly complex, involving multiple system failures that required creative problem-solving beyond memorized emergency checklists. Rebecca's performance during the emergency simulations provided the most dramatic demonstration yet of the disconnect between her simple preparation methods and her actual flying capabilities. When faced with scenarios that overwhelmed other candidates, she maintained control through techniques that seemed to bypass the sophisticated computer assistance that other pilots relied upon. Captain Mitchell watched Rebecca's emergency simulation through the observation window, her expression cycling through confusion, admiration, and professional jealousy as Rebecca handled crisis situations that had defeated some of the most experienced pilots in the program. "She's flying that aircraft like the computer systems don't exist," Mitchell told Master Sergeant Walsh. "Those are not normal pilot reactions to emergency situations." The simulation data revealed that Rebecca was somehow maintaining aircraft control through direct manipulation of flight surfaces and engine controls, using manual techniques that shouldn't have been possible with the B-2's computer-assisted flight systems. Her method suggested an understanding of aerodynamic principles that allowed her to compensate for computer failures through pure pilot skill. Master Sergeant Walsh found himself reviewing Rebecca's performance data multiple times, trying to understand how she had achieved results that seemed to contradict the fundamental design principles of stealth aircraft systems. "This is impossible," he told Flight Sergeant Santos privately. "The B-2 cannot be flown manually without computer assistance. The aerodynamic characteristics make it inherently unstable without constant electronic corrections." Santos had been conducting her own analysis of Rebecca's techniques, studying video footage of her control inputs and comparing them to the aircraft's response patterns. What she discovered was even more puzzling than Walsh's observations. Rebecca appeared to be making control adjustments that anticipated the aircraft's behavior rather than reacting to it, suggesting a level of familiarity with stealth aircraft dynamics that shouldn't have been possible. The day's final evaluation involved tactical formation flying exercises that tested pilots' ability to maintain precise positioning relative to other aircraft while executing complex maneuvers that simulated operational requirements for stealth bomber missions. Formation flying required the kind of spatial awareness and timing precision that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. Rebecca's formation flying performance provided the most convincing evidence, yet that her capabilities extended far beyond what her simple preparation methods should have made possible. She maintained position relative to other aircraft with precision that suggested years of experience with formation procedures, executing maneuvers that required split-second timing and three-dimensional thinking. Major Thompson found himself flying wing position relative to Rebecca during one formation exercise, giving him a first-hand perspective on her flying technique that challenged every assumption he had made about her capabilities. Her aircraft movements were smooth and predictable, demonstrating the kind of piloting skill that came from extensive training rather than beginner's luck. "I don't understand what's happening here," Thompson radioed to Brooks during a brief break. "In the formation exercise, Chun is flying like she's been doing this for decades, but everything about her background suggests she shouldn't be capable of this level of performance." The growing confusion among Rebecca's fellow candidates was compounded by her continued reliance on her paper airplane for what appeared to be ongoing aerodynamic analysis. During breaks between exercises, she could be observed making adjustments to the paper aircraft's configuration, testing different fold patterns and wing angles with the same seriousness that other pilots brought to computer-assisted flight planning. Wing Commander Hayes had been monitoring all aspects of the evaluation process, comparing candidate performance against standards that had been developed through years of stealth aircraft operations. Rebecca's results created patterns that didn't match any previous pilot evaluation she had supervised, suggesting capabilities that existed outside normal training paradigms. "There's something we're not seeing here," Hayes told Colonel Richardson during their private assessment conference. "Chun's performance data indicates skills that require years of advanced training to develop, but her background documentation doesn't support that level of experience. Either our evaluation methods are flawed, or we're dealing with someone whose qualifications aren't adequately reflected in standard personnel records." The second day concluded with candidate rankings that placed Rebecca among the top performers, despite continued criticism of her unconventional methods from fellow pilots, who couldn't reconcile her simple approach with her exceptional results. The cognitive dissonance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for candidates who had built their careers on technological sophistication and traditional training methodologies. Flight Sergeant Santos approached Rebecca after the final simulation session with questions that reflected the growing institutional confusion about her capabilities. "Ma'am," Santos said carefully, "your performance today was exceptional, but your techniques don't match any training protocols in our database. Could you help us understand how you develop these capabilities?" Rebecca's answer provided more questions than solutions, while hinting at depths of experience that her simple appearance continued to conceal. "Flying is flying," she said quietly, carefully folding her paper airplane with movements that had become routine throughout the evaluation process. "The principles that keep paper aircraft aloft are the same ones that govern any flying machine. Scale and complexity change, but the fundamentals remain constant." The third morning at Edwards Air Force Base arrived with apocalyptic weather conditions that transformed the desert installation into something resembling an alien landscape. Hurricane-force winds whipped across the tarmac, carrying sand and debris that reduced visibility to mere yards. The storm system that meteorologists had been tracking for days had intensified beyond all predictions, creating atmospheric disturbances that would have grounded civilian aviation indefinitely. Lightning crackled through the darkness overhead, accompanied by thunder that shook the massive hangars and made normal conversation impossible without shouting. Inside the climate-controlled operations center, the final phase of pilot selection was scheduled to proceed despite conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced aviators under normal circumstances. The storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an integral part of the evaluation process, designed to identify candidates who could maintain operational effectiveness when environmental factors eliminated every margin for error. General Patricia Morrison had arrived during the night, her presence at Edwards indicating that this selection process carried implications extending far beyond routine pilot training. Morrison's 4 stars represented a career that had spanned the development of stealth technology from its earliest experimental phases through its evolution into America's primary strategic deterrent. When Morrison personally observed pilot evaluations, it meant that national security considerations were directly involved in the selection outcomes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the assembled candidates, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made decisions affecting global stability. "Today's evaluation will involve actual flight operations under conditions that simulate the most challenging scenarios our stealth bomber crews might encounter in hostile territories." The final evaluation phase would require pilots to demonstrate their capabilities in actual B-2 Spirit aircraft, flying missions that incorporated everything they had learned during the previous 2 days while contending with weather conditions that pushed both human and mechanical systems to their operational limits. This wasn't a simulation, it was real flying in aircraft worth over $2 billion each, where mistakes could result in catastrophic losses of equipment and personnel. Major Jake Thompson felt his confidence wavering for the first time since arriving at Edwards. The storm conditions visible through the operations center windows created flying challenges that exceeded anything in his previous experience. Wind shear readings indicated atmospheric turbulence that could tear wings off conventional aircraft, while electromagnetic interference from the lightning was disrupting communication and navigation systems throughout the base. "This is insane," Thompson said to Lieutenant Colonel Brooks during the mission briefing period. "They can't seriously expect us to fly stealth bombers in these conditions. The weather alone makes this a suicide mission, and we haven't even factored in the aircraft complexity." Brooks shared Thompson's concern about the extreme conditions, but his special operations background had taught him that real-world missions rarely waited for ideal circumstances. "Combat operations don't get postponed because of bad weather," he replied grimly. "If we can't handle this environment, we can't handle whatever they're training us for." The mission parameters that General Morrison outlined were staggering in their complexity. Each pilot would be required to navigate through the storm system while maintaining stealth protocols, execute precision bombing runs on ground targets barely visible through the atmospheric disturbance, and return to Edwards through weather conditions that were continuing to deteriorate throughout the morning. Rebecca Chen sat quietly during the mission briefing, her paper airplane resting on the table before her as she made notes on her graph paper with the same methodical precision that had characterized her preparation throughout the selection process. The contrast between her simple tools and the sophisticated mission planning systems surrounding her had become even more pronounced as the stakes escalated to actual flight operations. Wing Commander Patricia Hayes approached Rebecca's planning station with the expression of someone who had finally decided to address a situation that had been troubling her for 3 days. Hayes had observed Rebecca's consistent excellence despite unconventional methods, but the prospect of actual flight operations in extreme weather demanded absolute confidence in every pilot's capabilities. "Chun," Hayes said formally, "I need to understand exactly what you think you're going to accomplish with that paper airplane when you're flying a real stealth bomber through hurricane conditions. This isn't a training exercise anymore. This is real flying with real consequences." Rebecca looked up from her handwritten calculations, meeting Hayes's gaze with the calm confidence that had remained constant throughout her time at Edwards. "Ma'am," she replied quietly, "this paper airplane has taught me everything I need to know about flying through storms. The principles are the same regardless of the aircraft's size or complexity. Her response struck Hayes as either profound wisdom or dangerous delusion, with no middle ground between those interpretations. The idea that fundamental aerodynamic principles could be understood through paper airplane experimentation seemed absurd when applied to billion-dollar stealth aircraft operating under extreme conditions. Captain Sarah Mitchell found herself facing a crisis of professional confidence as she watched Rebecca's continued calm preparation for what promised to be the most challenging flying of their careers. Mitchell's own success had been built on exhaustive technical preparation and aggressive competitiveness, yet Rebecca seemed immune to the stress that was affecting every other candidate in the program. She's either completely insane or she knows something we don't, Mitchell told Flight Sergeant Santos during the pre-flight equipment check. Nobody approaches this kind of flying challenge with that level of casual confidence, unless they have experience we're not aware of. Santos had been conducting her own investigation into Rebecca's background, reviewing personnel files and authorization documents with increasing fascination. The deeper she dug into Rebecca's qualifications, the more questions arose about training, programs and operational experience that didn't appear in standard military databases. The flight line preparation area had been transformed into a scene from an apocalyptic movie. Ground crews worked in conditions that required safety lines to prevent them from being blown across the tarmac, while the B-2 Spirit aircraft sat like sleeping giants under protective covers that whipped and snapped in the hurricane winds. The stealth bombers represented the pinnacle of aerospace engineering, but even they appeared vulnerable against the raw power of the approaching storm. Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh supervised the pre-flight inspections with the grim determination of someone who understood that mechanical failure during these conditions would likely prove fatal. Every system had to be perfect, every backup procedure verified, and every emergency protocol rehearsed one final time before pilots committed themselves to flying conditions that challenged the limits of human capability. This is going to separate the real pilots from the pretenders, Walsh told his ground crew during the final equipment checks. Weather like this doesn't forgive mistakes, and stealth bombers aren't forgiving aircraft under the best circumstances. Rebecca approached her assigned B-2 Spirit with the same methodical calm she had displayed throughout the selection process. The aircraft towered above her, its triangular shape looking more like an artifact from an advanced civilization than something built by human engineering. Every surface was designed to deflect radar signals, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly while simultaneously representing the most sophisticated aerospace technology ever developed. The other pilots gathering around their assigned aircraft carried themselves with the tense energy of people preparing for the ultimate test of their professional capabilities. Years of training, countless hours of study, and career-defining ambitions all converged on their ability to successfully complete missions that would determine who among them possessed the rare combination of skills necessary for stealth bomber operations. Major Thompson approached Rebecca as she conducted her pre-flight inspection, his expression that of someone who had finally decided to voice concerns that had been building for 3 days. "Chun," he said, his voice carrying the competitive edge that had defined his military career, "I don't know what game you're playing here, but this isn't a simulation anymore. Real flying in these conditions requires skills that can't be learned from children's toys." Rebecca continued her methodical inspection of the aircraft's control surfaces, checking systems with movements that suggested deep familiarity with stealth bomber operations. "You're absolutely right, Major," she replied without looking up from her work. "These conditions demand every bit of skill and experience a pilot can bring to bear." Her acknowledgement of the challenge seemed reasonable, but there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't intimidated by conditions that were clearly affecting every other candidate in the program. Thompson found himself wondering if Rebecca's calm demeanor indicated exceptional mental toughness or dangerous lack of awareness about the risks they were all facing. Lieutenant. Colonel Brooks joined the conversation with the bearing of someone who had decided that direct confrontation was necessary to resolve the questions surrounding Rebecca's capabilities. The truth is, Chun, none of us understand how you've achieved the scores you've posted during this selection process. Your methods don't make sense, your equipment is inadequate, and your background doesn't support the level of performance you've demonstrated. Rebecca finally looked up from her aircraft inspection, meeting Brooks's challenging gaze with steady brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience he couldn't quite place. "Performance speaks for itself, Lieutenant Colonel," she said simply. "Results matter more than methods." Her response frustrated Brooks because it avoided addressing the fundamental questions about her qualifications while simultaneously challenging him to prove that her unconventional approach was inadequate. The confrontation had reached a point where words were insufficient to resolve the growing tension among the candidates. General Morrison's voice crackled over the flight line communication system, cutting through the wind noise and forcing all conversations to halt. "Pilots, you have 15 minutes to complete pre-flight preparations. Weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate, and our window for safe operations is closing rapidly." The announcement created a sense of urgency that transformed the preparation area into a scene of controlled chaos. Ground crews scrambled to complete final system checks, while pilots rushed through procedures that normally required careful deliberation. The storm was forcing everyone to operate at the very limits of safe procedures, adding time pressure to an already challenging mission profile. Rebecca pulled her paper airplane from her flight suit pocket one final time, examining its simple construction with the kind of attention that other pilots devoted to million-dollar flight computers. The gesture was so incongruous with the sophisticated preparation occurring around her that several candidates stopped their own work to stare in disbelief. "This is it," Thompson announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Either she proves that paper airplanes can teach you to fly stealth bombers, or she finally admits that real aviation requires real preparation." His challenge hung in the storm-laden air like a gauntlet thrown down before medieval knights, demanding a response that would settle the questions surrounding Rebecca's capabilities once and for all. Wing Commander Hayes monitored the growing confrontation with professional concern about how interpersonal tensions might affect mission safety during already dangerous flying conditions. The weather alone created risks that demanded absolute focus and cooperation among all participants, leaving no room for competitive distractions that could prove catastrophic. "Pilots," Hayes announced over the communication system, "personal disputes end now. Your focus must be entirely on mission completion and safe recovery. Save your arguments for after we're all back on the ground." Rebecca acknowledged Hayes's instruction with a professional nod, while carefully folding her paper airplane and securing it in her flight suit pocket. The simple gesture carried finality, as if she were putting away a tool whose usefulness had been completed. Her expression remained calm and confident, showing none of the stress that was clearly affecting her fellow candidates. The final moments before engine start created a strange calm amid the chaos of the approaching storm. Each pilot sat alone in their cockpit, surrounded by technology that represented decades of aerospace development, preparing to demonstrate their mastery of systems that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. The next few hours would determine who among them possessed the extraordinary combination of skills necessary to operate America's most advanced strategic weapons. Rebecca's hands moved over the B-2's control systems with fluid precision, executing pre-flight procedures with the kind of muscle memory that suggested extensive prior experience. Her movements were efficient and confident, displaying none of the hesitation that might be expected from someone encountering these systems for the first time. The storm continued to intensify outside, creating conditions that would challenge every aspect of their training while providing the ultimate test of their ability to maintain operational effectiveness when circumstances eliminated every margin for error. The real flying was about to begin, The moment Rebecca Chun's B-2 Spirit lifted off from Edwards Air Force Base, something extraordinary became apparent to every observer monitoring the flight operations. While the other pilots struggled against the hurricane-force winds that threatened to tear their aircraft apart, Rebecca's stealth bomber rose through the turbulence with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Her aircraft moved like it was dancing with the storm rather than fighting it, finding pockets of stable air that shouldn't have existed and utilizing wind currents that other pilots couldn't even detect. In the primary control tower, General Patricia Morrison watched the radar displays with growing amazement as Rebecca's aircraft signature behaved unlike anything she had witnessed in 30 years of observing stealth operations. The B-2's flight path carved through the storm system with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of atmospheric dynamics far beyond what any pilot should have possessed without extensive meteorological training. How is she doing that? Morrison asked the senior controller monitoring Rebecca's progress. The radar showed Rebecca's aircraft maintaining perfect altitude control while every other pilot in the formation struggled with wind shear that was throwing their aircraft around like toys in a hurricane. The atmospheric conditions should have made stable flight impossible, yet Rebecca seemed to be anticipating turbulence before it occurred. Major Jake Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, strain evident despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. "Control, this is Thunder 1. I'm encountering severe turbulence at 15,000 feet. Request permission to deviate from assigned altitude." His B-2 was being hammered by wind shear that made precise flying nearly impossible, forcing him to fight for basic aircraft control rather than focusing on mission objectives. "Thunder 1, maintain current altitude," came the response from flight control. "Storm conditions are consistent across all altitudes. Deviation will not improve your situation." The controller's words carried the implicit message that this was exactly the kind of challenge that stealth bomber pilots needed to master. There would be no easy alternatives when operating in hostile territories. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks found himself in similar difficulty, his special operations experience proving inadequate for the unique challenges of flying a stealth bomber through extreme weather. "Control, this is Thunder 2. My aircraft is handling like it's got a mind of its own. Computer systems are having trouble compensating for the atmospheric disturbance." His voice revealed frustration with technology that had failed to provide the assistance he had been trained to expect. Rebecca's voice came over the radio with calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with the stress evident in her fellow pilots' communications. "Control, Thunder 3 requesting permission to demonstrate alternative flight profile through the storm system." Her transmission was clear and confident, showing no signs of the atmospheric interference that was affecting other aircraft communications. Control tower erupted in surprised murmurs as personnel tried to understand what Rebecca could possibly mean by an alternative flight profile when flying a computer-controlled aircraft through hurricane conditions. The B-2 Spirit wasn't designed for manual flying. It's inherently unstable. Aerodynamics required constant computer corrections to maintain controlled flight. Wing Commander Patricia Hayes grabbed the radio microphone with the urgency of someone who needed to prevent a potential catastrophe. "Thunder 3, negative on alternative profiles. Maintain standard flight procedures and computer assistance. This is not the time for experimental techniques." Rebecca's response surprised everyone monitoring the flight operations. "Roger, Control. However, if standard procedures continue to prove inadequate for current conditions, request permission to implement manual flight control techniques." The suggestion that anyone could manually fly a B-2 Spirit through a hurricane seemed so absurd that several controllers exchanged confused glances. What happened next redefined everyone's understanding of what was possible in military aviation. Rebecca's aircraft began executing maneuvers that seemed to violate the fundamental design limitations of stealth bomber operations. She was somehow maintaining precise flight control without relying on the computer, assistance that every other pilot considered essential for B-2 operations. Flight Sergeant Maria Santos monitored Rebecca's aircraft systems from the ground control station, watching telemetry data that contradicted everything she knew about stealth bomber flight characteristics. "Sir," she reported to Hayes, "Thunder 3's flight control inputs suggest she's bypassing primary computer assistance and flying the aircraft manually. That should be impossible. The B-2 cannot maintain stable flight without electronic flight." Control systems. Hayes stared at the telemetry displays, showing Rebecca's aircraft performing maneuvers that textbook aerodynamics said were impossible for a flying wing design. "Are you certain about that data?" she asked Santos. "Because what I'm seeing suggests someone is flying that aircraft like it's a conventional fighter jet rather than a computer-controlled stealth bomber." The weather radar showed the storm system intensifying beyond all previous projections, with wind speeds approaching 200 miles per hour and electromagnetic interference that was disrupting electronic systems throughout the region. Lightning strikes were occurring at altitudes where the aircraft were operating, creating electromagnetic pulses that could disable navigation and communication equipment without warning. Captain Sarah Mitchell's aircraft was being battered by turbulence that made coherent radio transmissions nearly impossible. Control Thunder 4, losing hydraulic pressure. Computer systems intermittent. Her words came in fragments as G-forces from the turbulence made normal speech difficult. The sophisticated technology that was supposed to make stealth bomber operations possible was failing under conditions that exceeded its design parameters. Rebecca's aircraft continued to move through the storm with fluid precision that seemed almost supernatural. She was finding flight paths through the atmospheric chaos that allowed her to maintain mission objectives while other pilots fought desperately just to keep their aircraft under control. Her radio transmissions remained clear and professional, suggesting that she was somehow avoiding the worst effects of the electromagnetic interference. Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh monitored the mission from the ground control center, comparing Rebecca's performance against every standard he had developed for evaluating pilot capability during his career. "I've never seen anything like this," he told General Morrison. "She's not just flying through the storm, she's using it. Her aircraft is gaining speed and altitude efficiency by riding wind currents that our meteorological systems can't even detect." The bombing run portion of the mission provided the most dramatic demonstration of Rebecca's extraordinary capabilities. While other pilots struggled to acquire targets through the atmospheric disturbance, Rebecca's aircraft approached the bombing range with precision that suggested she could see through the storm. Her weapon delivery was flawless, hitting targets with accuracy that exceeded peacetime training standards, despite flying through conditions that should have made precision bombing impossible. Major Thompson's bombing run was a disaster by comparison. Wind shear threw his aircraft off course during the critical final approach, forcing him to abort the bombing run and circle for another attempt. Control Thunder 1 requesting a second approach. Storm conditions made target acquisition impossible on first pass. His voice carried the frustration of someone whose technical expertise was proven inadequate for the challenges he was facing. "Thunder 1, you are cleared for the second approach," came the response from control. "Be advised that weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate. This may be your final opportunity for target engagement." The warning carried implicit acknowledgement that the storm was pushing all operations beyond safe limits. Rebecca's second target engagement was even more impressive than her first. She somehow compensated for wind conditions that were throwing other aircraft around like leaves in a tornado, delivering precision strikes that demonstrated mastery of ballistic calculations under extreme environmental conditions. Her accuracy scores were perfect, achieved through methods that defied every principle of modern bombing technology. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks managed to complete his bombing run on the third attempt, but his accuracy was well below acceptable. Standards for stealth bomber operations. Control, Thunder 2, mission complete. Requesting immediate return to base. My aircraft systems are showing multiple warnings, and I'm having difficulty maintaining altitude control. His admission of equipment problems reflected the toll that the extreme conditions were taking on both pilots and aircraft. The return flight to Edwards provided the final proof of Rebecca's extraordinary capabilities. While other pilots limped back to base with damaged aircraft and depleted fuel reserves, Rebecca's B-2 Spirit seemed to glide through the storm like it was designed for exactly these conditions. Her fuel consumption was actually lower than pre-flight calculations had predicted, suggesting that she had found ways to use the storm's energy to enhance rather than hinder her aircraft's performance. Captain Mitchell's aircraft developed serious hydraulic problems during the return flight, forcing her to declare an in-flight emergency. Mayday, Mayday, Thunder 4 declaring emergency. Complete hydraulic failure, partial loss of flight controls. Requesting immediate assistance and priority landing clearance. Her calm professionalism couldn't entirely mask the fear in her voice. As she faced the possibility of losing control completely, Rebecca's response to Mitchell's emergency was immediate and decisive. Control, Thunder 3 requesting permission to provide assistance to Thunder 4. I can escort her aircraft to a safe landing approach. Her offer was unprecedented. Stealth bombers weren't designed for formation flying under emergency conditions, especially during hurricane weather. Thunder 3, negative on escort assistance. Hayes responded immediately. Maintain your own flight safety and proceed to individual landing approaches. Emergency response teams are being positioned for Thunder 4's arrival. The standard procedures called for aircraft in distress to handle emergencies independently rather than risking additional aircraft in rescue attempts. Rebecca's next radio transmission changed everything. Control, with respect. Thunder 4's hydraulic failure is causing her aircraft to respond unpredictably to computer flight controls. Manual flight techniques could stabilize her approach if she's willing to trust unconventional methods. Her suggestion implied knowledge of emergency procedures that weren't part of standard stealth bomber training. The control tower fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Rebecca's offer. She was suggesting that manual flight control techniques could save Mitchell's aircraft when sophisticated computer systems were failing. The idea seemed impossible, yet Rebecca's own flight performance suggested she possessed capabilities that transcended normal pilot training. General Morrison made the decision that would be remembered in Air Force history. Thunder 3, you are authorized to provide whatever assistance you deem appropriate to Thunder 4. All standard procedures are suspended until both aircraft are safely on the ground. Her authorization gave Rebecca permission to attempt something that had never been tried before in stealth bomber operations. What followed was a masterclass in airmanship that redefined everyone's understanding of what was possible in military aviation. Rebecca guided Mitchell through manual flight control techniques that allowed her to maintain aircraft stability despite complete hydraulic failure. Her instructions were clear and confident, demonstrating knowledge of aircraft systems that shouldn't have been possible without years of specialized training. Thunder 4. Reduce your reliance on computer assistance and feel the aircraft's natural flight characteristics, Rebecca instructed over the radio. The B-2 wants to fly. You just need to work with its aerodynamic properties rather than fighting them. Her guidance was simultaneously simple and profound, suggesting an understanding of flight dynamics that went beyond technical training. Mitchell's aircraft stabilized under Rebecca's guidance, achieving controlled flight despite equipment failures that should have made landing impossible. Thunder 3, I don't understand how you know these techniques, but they're working. My aircraft is responding to manual inputs that I didn't know were possible. Mitchell's amazement was evident in her voice as she experienced capabilities she had never learned in formal training. The landing approach that followed was observed by every available person at Edwards Air Force Base. 2 stealth bombers descended through hurricane conditions using flight techniques that seemed to come from an earlier era of aviation, when pilots relied on skill and instinct rather than computer assistance. Rebecca guided both aircraft to safe landings that were witnessed by hundreds of observers who struggled to believe what they had seen. As Rebecca's B-2 Spirit touched down on the rain-soaked runway with the gentleness of a feather settling on still water, the silence in the control tower was absolute. Her aircraft had not only survived conditions that had nearly destroyed the other bombers, it had thrived in them, demonstrating capabilities that challenged every assumption about modern military aviation. The debriefing room at Edwards Air Force Base had never witnessed anything quite like the scene that unfolded in the hours following the storm mission. General Patricia Morrison sat at the head of a conference table, surrounded by flight data, mission recordings, and telemetry. Reports that documented performance levels she had never seen in 3 decades of military aviation. The other pilots sat in stunned silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the humbling realization that they had completely misjudged someone whose capabilities existed in realms they hadn't known were possible. Major Jake Thompson stared at his own performance scores with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of aviation had been shattered. His bombing accuracy had been barely acceptable, his flight control marginal at best, and his fuel consumption so excessive that he had landed with reserves dangerously close to emergency levels. Beside these numbers, Rebecca Chun's perfect scores seemed to mock everything he had believed about proper pilot training and technological superiority. I need someone to explain to me how a pilot with a paper airplane just outperformed the most elite aviators in the Air Force, Thompson said, his voice carrying confusion mixed with professional embarrassment. What we witness today contradicts everything I know about stealth bomber operations, aerodynamics, and basic physics. Lieutenant Colonel David Brooks found himself confronting the complete demolition of his assessment abilities. His special operations background had taught him to quickly identify capability and potential, yet he had completely failed to recognize extraordinary skill that had been hiding in plain sight. The manual flight control techniques Chun demonstrated shouldn't be possible with B-2 aircraft, he said slowly. The flying wing design is inherently unstable. Computer assistance isn't optional, it's essential for controlled flight. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat quietly, still processing the experience of being rescued from certain death by someone she had dismissed as incompetent just hours earlier. Rebecca's guidance had not only saved her life, but had taught her flying techniques that transformed her understanding of what was possible in military aviation. She didn't just know how to fly manually, Mitchell said finally. She understood systems interactions that aren't covered in any training program I've ever encountered. General Morrison's secure phone had been ringing constantly since the mission concluded, with calls from Pentagon officials, Air Force leadership, and intelligence agencies demanding explanations for performance, data that seemed to contradict the fundamental limitations of human capability. The flight recordings showed Rebecca accomplishing things that aerospace engineers insisted were impossible, using techniques that didn't appear in any pilot training manual. Wing Commander Patricia Hayes approached the conference table carrying a classified folder that had arrived via courier during the post-flight medical examinations. The documents inside bore security classifications that required special clearance to read, suggesting that Rebecca's background involved programs that operated at the highest levels of government secrecy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, her voice carrying the weight of revelations that would recontextualize everything they thought they knew about their fellow pilot. "I have authorization to share information about Captain Rebecca Chun that explains the extraordinary performance we witnessed today." The silence in the debriefing room was absolute as Hayes opened the classified folder and began reading from documents that painted a picture none of the pilots could have anticipated. Rebecca Chun wasn't just another candidate in the stealth bomber program. She was one of the original test pilots who had developed the flight techniques that made B-2 operations possible in the first place. Captain Chun holds the record for the most flight hours in B-2 Spirit aircraft of any pilot in Air Force history, Hayes continued, her words falling like hammer blows on the assembled pilots' assumptions. She was part of the classified development program that created the manual backup procedures we witness today, designed for situations when computer assistance fails during combat operations. Major Thompson felt his stomach drop as he realized the full extent of his morning's ignorance. He had been criticizing someone whose expertise exceeded his own by margins he couldn't even calculate. "How is that possible?" he asked weakly. She looked like a civilian who had never seen military aircraft before. Hayes consulted the classified documents before answering. Captain Chun's service record includes 15 years of experimental flight testing under programs so classified that they don't appear in standard personnel databases. She was personally selected by the program directors to develop emergency procedures for stealth bomber operations, including manual flight control techniques that could save aircraft and crews when electronic systems failed. The revelation explained everything that had seemed impossible about Rebecca's performance, yet it raised even more questions about why someone with such extraordinary qualifications had been allowed to participate in a selection process designed for far less experienced pilots. The other candidates found themselves grappling with the realization that they had been competing against someone whose expertise made their own accomplishments seem elementary. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks discovered that his assessment abilities hadn't failed. They had been deliberately misdirected by someone whose background was so classified that it didn't appear in accessible records. "Those authorization codes on her paperwork," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "They weren't standard military classifications. They were references to black programs that we don't have clearance to know about." Flight Sergeant Maria Santos had been conducting her own investigation into Rebecca's equipment and methods, trying to understand how someone could achieve such extraordinary results with such simple tools. The truth was even more remarkable than the performance they had witnessed. Rebecca's paper airplane wasn't a toy or training aid, but a sophisticated aerodynamic testing device she had developed during years of experimental aircraft work. Captain Chun's paper airplane incorporates design principles that took our engineering teams years to understand, Santos reported to the assembled group. The fold patterns and weight distribution represent scaled-down versions of stealth aircraft control surfaces. She was using it to test flight dynamics in real-time atmospheric conditions. The paper airplane that had drawn so much ridicule was revealed to be an ingenious tool that demonstrated aerodynamic principles through direct experimentation rather than computer modeling. Rebecca had been conducting miniature flight tests throughout the selection process, gathering data about wind conditions and atmospheric disturbances that informed her approach to full-scale aircraft operations. General Morrison's next revelation struck the assembled pilots like a physical blow. Captain Chun's participation in the selection process wasn't as a candidate, she announced. She was here as an evaluator, observing how current pilot training methods compared to the techniques she helped develop 15 years ago. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful as the pilots realized they had been judged by someone they had spent 3 days dismissing as incompetent. Their comments, criticisms, and barely concealed mockery had been observed and evaluated by one of the most accomplished aviators in Air Force history, someone whose innovations had made their own careers possible. Major Thompson found his voice first, though it carried none of his earlier confidence. "Man," he said to Morrison, "are you saying that Captain Chun was testing us rather than competing with us?" The implications of that revelation made his behavior over the previous 3 days seem not just inappropriate, but professionally suicidal. Morrison nodded grimly. Captain Chun's mission was to evaluate whether current pilot training produces aviators capable of adapting to unexpected challenges and equipment failures. Her assessment will determine how we modify training programs for future stealth bomber operations. The room fell silent as each pilot contemplated how their treatment of Rebecca would be reflected in her evaluation reports. They had demonstrated not just technical limitations, but character flaws that could affect their military careers for years to come. The woman they had mocked for her simple methods had been documenting their responses to someone who appeared different from their expectations. Captain Mitchell broke the silence with a question that reflected her growing understanding of the situation. Captain Chun's rescue of my aircraft during the hydraulic failure, was that part of the evaluation, or was she genuinely trying to help? The distinction mattered because it would reveal whether Rebecca's assistants had been motivated by professional duty or personal compassion. Hayes consulted her classified documents before answering. Captain Chun's intervention during your emergency was not part of her evaluation mission. She risked her own safety and mission objectives to prevent the loss of your aircraft and potentially your life. The revelation that Rebecca had acted from genuine concern rather than professional obligation made her earlier graciousness even more remarkable. The technical analysis of Rebecca's flight performance provided additional insights into capabilities that transcended normal pilot training. Her fuel consumption had been 30% lower than predicted, achieved through flight techniques that utilized atmospheric energy rather than fighting against it. Her bombing accuracy had been perfect despite conditions that should have made precision weapons delivery impossible. The manual flight control techniques Captain Chun demonstrated will be incorporated into emergency training protocols for all stealth bomber crews, Morrison announced. Her innovations during today's mission potentially saved not just Captain Mitchell's aircraft, but established procedures that could save lives in future operations. Wing Commander Hayes shared additional details about Rebecca's background that painted a picture of someone whose contributions to military aviation extended far beyond a single evaluation mission. She had been involved in developing the original stealth bomber training curriculum, had tested prototype aircraft that never reached production, and had served as an advisor to programs that remained classified decades after their completion. Captain Chun's expertise in manual flight control techniques stems from her work on early stealth prototypes that lacked the sophisticated computer assistance available in current aircraft, Hayes explained. She learned to fly unstable aircraft configurations through pure pilot skill, developing techniques that became the foundation for emergency procedures used throughout the Air Force. The paper airplane that had symbolized Rebecca's supposed incompetence was revealed to be part of a sophisticated testing methodology she had developed for evaluating atmospheric conditions without relying on electronic instruments that could fail or be detected by enemy forces. Her simple tools represented decades of innovation in covert flight testing techniques. Flight Sergeant Santos provided the final piece of the puzzle that completed the pilot's understanding of what they had witnessed. Captain Chun's authorization to participate in this program came directly from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. She announced, "This evaluation was requested at the highest levels of military leadership to assess the effectiveness of current training methods." The revelation that Rebecca's presence had been authorized at the very top of the Air Force hierarchy explained the mysterious paperwork that had puzzled personnel throughout the selection process. Her qualifications hadn't been missing from databases, they had been deliberately obscured to prevent the kind of special treatment that would have compromised the evaluation's objectivity. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks found himself facing a profound reassessment of his own judgment and leadership capabilities. "Captain Chun," he said directly to Rebecca, who had remained silent throughout the revelations about her background, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond professional courtesy. My assessment of your capabilities was not just wrong, it was embarrassingly incompetent." Rebecca's response demonstrated the same grace she had shown throughout the entire selection process. "No apology necessary, Lieutenant Colonel," she said quietly. "Your reactions were based on available information and reasonable assumptions about pilot training methods. The evaluation was designed to create exactly the kind of confusion you experienced." Her willingness to excuse behavior that had been dismissive and occasionally insulting revealed character that impressed the assembled officers even more than her extraordinary flying skills. She had endured 3 days of criticism and mockery while secretly documenting their responses, yet she showed no resentment or superiority toward people who had completely underestimated her capabilities. Major Thompson struggled to find words that could express his regret for comments that now seemed not just inappropriate, but professionally damaging to his own reputation. "Ma'am," he said finally, "everything I said about your methods and equipment was completely out of line. I should have recognized that excellence can take forms that don't match conventional expectations." Rebecca's answer provided a lesson in humility that would influence how all the pilots approached future evaluations of their peers. "Excellence often appears in unexpected packages," she said simply. "The most dangerous assumption in military aviation is that capability can be judged by appearance rather than demonstrated through performance." The debriefing session concluded with General Morrison's announcement that Rebecca's evaluation would result in significant changes to pilot training programs throughout the Air Force. Her assessment had identified weaknesses in current methods that left pilots unprepared for the kind of challenges they might face in real-world operations. Captain Chun's report will recommend increased emphasis on fundamental flying skills that don't depend on computer assistance, Morrison announced. Her demonstration today proved that technology can enhance pilot capability, but it cannot replace the basic airmanship that separates good pilots from exceptional ones. The pilots who had learned this lesson firsthand would carry it with them throughout their careers, fundamentally changing how they evaluated capability and approached the challenge of working with people whose methods differed from their own. Expectations. 6 months after the legendary storm flight at Edwards Air Force Base, the reverberations of Rebecca Chun's evaluation continued to reshape military aviation training across the entire United States Air Force. The Chun Protocol, as it came to be known throughout pilot training communities, had revolutionized how the military approached the fundamental relationship between human skill and technological assistance. What had begun as a simple evaluation of candidate selection methods had evolved into a comprehensive overhaul of aviation training philosophy that would influence generations of future pilots. At the newly established Chun Center for Advanced Flight Training, located in a state-of-the-art facility adjacent to Edwards Air Force Base, a bronze statue stood in the main lobby depicting a pilot holding a paper airplane while gazing toward the sky. The inscription beneath read, "Excellence appears in unexpected forms. Captain Rebecca Chen, whose simple tools taught complex truths." The memorial had become a pilgrimage site for military aviators from around the world, each seeking to understand how fundamental principles could transcend technological sophistication. Major Jake Thompson stood before that statue on a crisp December morning, wearing the insignia of his new position as Director of Emergency Flight Procedures Training. His transformation from a technology-dependent pilot to someone who understood the deeper principles of aviation had been painful but profound. The humiliation he had experienced during the selection process had ultimately saved his career by teaching him lessons that no amount of conventional training could have provided. "She changed everything we thought we knew about flying," Thompson said to a group of new pilot candidates gathered for their first orientation session. "Captain Chun proved that the most sophisticated aircraft in the world are still dependent on pilots who understand the fundamental principles that make flight possible." His voice carried the conviction of someone whose worldview had been permanently altered by witnessing true mastery in action. The training program that Thompson now incorporated Rebecca's manual flight control techniques into every phase of pilot education, ensuring that future aviators would be prepared for situations when technological assistance failed or became unavailable. The curriculum emphasized understanding over memorization, adaptability over rigid procedures, and fundamental skill development over equipment dependence. Lieutenant Colonel David Brooks had found his calling as an instructor in the advanced problem-solving courses that were now mandatory for all stealth bomber candidates. His special operations background, combined with the lessons he had learned from Rebecca's evaluation, made him uniquely qualified to teach pilots how to think creatively under pressure. The course syllabus he had developed was built around scenarios where conventional solutions proved inadequate and success required innovative approaches to seemingly impossible challenges. The enemy doesn't care about your equipment specifications or training curriculum, Brooks would tell his students during particularly challenging simulation exercises. They care about whether you can complete your mission when everything goes wrong simultaneously. Captain Chun taught us that real capability comes from understanding principles so deeply that you can apply them even when your familiar tools are taken away. Brooks's most popular lecture series focused on the danger of assumption-based evaluation, using Rebecca's paper airplane demonstration as a case study in how appearances could deceive even experienced professionals. His students learned to look beyond surface indicators when assessing capability, recognizing that true expertise often appeared in forms that didn't match conventional expectations. Captain Sarah Mitchell had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all the original candidates. Her near-death experience during the hydraulic failure, followed by Rebecca's life-saving intervention, had fundamentally changed her approach to both flying and leadership. Mitchell now served as the primary instructor for emergency procedures training, teaching other pilots the manual flight control techniques that had saved her life. When your computers fail and your backup systems are offline, you discover whether you're really a pilot or just a systems operator, Mitchell would explain during her emergency procedures courses. Captain Chun saved my life by teaching me that the aircraft wants to fly. My job is to understand its natural characteristics well enough to work with them rather than against them. Mitchell's personal story had become legendary within Air Force training circles, serving as a powerful reminder that technological failure could occur without warning and that survival often depended on skills that couldn't be programmed into computer systems. Her classes consistently ranked among the most popular in the advanced training curriculum, partly because her students knew they were learning from someone who had applied these techniques under life-or-death conditions. The wider impact of Rebecca's evaluation extended far beyond individual career transformations. The Air Force had implemented sweeping changes to recruitment and assessment procedures, recognizing that their previous methods had been systematically overlooking candidates whose capabilities didn't fit conventional profiles. The new evaluation protocols emphasized demonstrated ability over credentials, problem-solving skills over equipment familiarity, and adaptability over rigid adherence to established procedures. Flight Sergeant Maria Santos had been promoted to Master Sergeant and given responsibility for developing new evaluation criteria that would prevent future oversights like the one that had nearly excluded Rebecca from consideration. Her research into alternative assessment methods had become the foundation for a more comprehensive approach to identifying pilot potential that looked beyond traditional indicators of capability. We were so focused on technological proficiency that we almost missed the most skilled pilot any of us had ever encountered, Santos would explain to her evaluation training classes. Captain Chun's example taught us that expertise comes in many forms, and our assessment methods needed to be sophisticated enough to recognize excellence regardless of how it was packaged. The international aviation community had taken notice of the revolutionary training methods emerging from Edwards Air Force Base, military delegations from allied nations, regularly visited the Chun Center to observe training techniques that had produced measurable improvements in pilot performance across all aircraft types. The manual flight control methods that Rebecca had demonstrated were being adapted for civilian aviation training, where they provided valuable backup skills for commercial pilots who might face similar emergency situations. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief aerospace engineer who had originally designed the B-2's computer-assisted flight control systems, had spent months studying Rebecca's manual flight techniques to understand how human pilots could achieve what she had believed was only possible through electronic assistance. Her research had led to the development of hybrid control systems that combined computer precision with human intuition, creating aircraft that were both more capable and more survivable than previous designs. Captain Chun's demonstration forced U.S. to reconsider the relationship between human capability and machine assistance. Dr. Foster explained during a technical conference attended by aerospace engineers from around the world. We discovered that our most advanced aircraft were actually limiting pilot potential by replacing human skill rather than enhancing it. The paper airplane that had symbolized Rebecca's supposed incompetence had been preserved in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, displayed alongside the most significant artifacts in aviation history. The simple folded paper sat in a place of honor next to the Wright brothers' original aircraft and Chuck Yeager's X-1, representing a moment when the fundamental principles of flight had been demonstrated to be more important than technological sophistication. Visitors to the museum often struggled to understand why a child's toy occupied such a prominent position among the treasures of aviation achievement. The accompanying placard explained that the paper airplane represented the triumph of understanding over assumption, simplicity over complexity, and human capability over technological dependence. Rebecca Chun herself had returned to her previous assignment with a classified experimental aircraft program, her brief appearance at Edwards having accomplished its intended purpose of identifying weaknesses in pilot training methods. Her recommendations had been implemented throughout the Air Force, but she had declined all offers of public recognition or ceremonial positions that would have taken her away from the hands-on flight testing work she preferred. The annual Chun Memorial Lecture at the Air Force Academy had become the most prestigious speaking engagement in military aviation, attracting audiences that included not just cadets but senior officers, aerospace engineers, and international observers seeking to understand the principles that had revolutionized pilot training. The speakers for these lectures were always chosen for their ability to challenge conventional thinking and inspire innovation in aviation education. Colonel Marcus Richardson, who had overseen the original selection process, now served as the director of pilot training reform initiatives that were being implemented throughout the military aviation community. His experience with Rebecca's evaluation had taught him that the most important qualifications for leadership positions often couldn't be measured through conventional metrics. We learned that our assessment methods were filtering out exactly the kind of innovative thinking we most needed. Richardson would explain to policymakers considering similar reforms in other areas of military training. Captain Chun's example showed us that excellence often appears in forms that don't match our preconceived notions of what competence should look like. The psychological impact of Rebecca's demonstration had extended beyond technical training into broader questions about leadership, evaluation, and organizational culture. Military leadership schools now included case studies of the Edwards evaluation as an example of how cognitive bias could blind even experienced professionals to extraordinary capability that didn't fit expected patterns. Wing Commander Patricia Hayes had been selected to lead a comprehensive review of military training methods across all service branches, using the lessons learned from Rebecca's evaluation to identify similar blind spots in other areas of professional development. Her work had revealed that the problems identified in pilot training existed throughout the military, where technological sophistication had sometimes replaced rather than enhanced human capability. The legacy of the Stormflight continued to influence aviation training philosophy years after the original evaluation. New pilots arriving at Edwards Air Force Base were required to study detailed recordings of Rebecca's performance, not to replicate her specific techniques, but to understand the thinking process that had enabled her to achieve extraordinary results. Through fundamental skill rather than technological dependence, the Chen Center's research division had become a focal point for innovation in aviation training, developing new methods that balance technological assistance with human skill development. Their work attracted collaboration from civilian aviation authorities, university research programs, and international military organizations, seeking to apply similar principles to their own training curricula. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Rebecca's evaluation was the cultural shift it had created within the military aviation community. The arrogance and assumption-based thinking that had characterized many elite pilots had been replaced by humility and openness to learning from unexpected sources. The phrase "paper airplane wisdom" had entered the lexicon of military aviation, representing the idea that profound insights could come from the simplest sources. Major Thompson's final lecture to each graduating class of pilot candidates always concluded with the same message. Captain Chun taught us that true mastery isn't about having the best equipment or the most advanced training. It's about understanding principles so deeply that you can apply them regardless of circumstances. The most dangerous pilot is not the one with the latest technology, but the one who assumes that technology can replace fundamental skill and understanding. The bronze statue in the Chen Center lobby had been joined by a collection of paper airplanes sent by pilots from around the world, each representing a personal commitment to maintaining the balance between technological capability and human skill that Rebecca had demonstrated. The display served as a daily reminder that excellence often appeared in the most unexpected forms, requiring wisdom and humility to recognize and appreciate. Rebecca Chun's brief appearance at Edwards Air Force Base had lasted only 3 days, but the principles she had demonstrated continued to influence military aviation decades later. Her legacy lived not just in the specific techniques she had taught, but in the fundamental shift she had created in how the military approached the relationship between human capability and technological assistance. The paper airplane had proven mightier than the most sophisticated aircraft, teaching lessons that would echo through the skies for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.